Hey everyone, Ryan Smith here. I'm going to be doing something a bit different for the month of February. A key part of my heathen spiritual practice is standing up for a more inclusive world. Lately, bigoted, far-right elements have been surging ahead in politics and society more aggressively than ever. The heathen movement is no stranger to these problems, as we've been in struggle with them since the modern revival began in the 1970s. This is why, beginning February 7th, I will be releasing a short-run podcast special on Wayward Wanderer called Streams of Resistance. Over the month of February, you will be hearing from members of the heathen movement, anti-fascists, ex-evangelicals, and more about the state of the far right in their spaces and what this means for all of us. Tune in to Streams of Resistance. Find out where the extreme right currently stands and what we can do about it. Check out Streams of Resistance beginning February 7th at wherever you get your podcasts. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the U.S. military and the far right.
Got the Marines, we've got the Air Force. And for my specific job in the Navy, I've been on ships, mostly deployed on destroyers and cruisers. I work as a spy technician, so one of the radars on a ship. I would operate, maintain, as well as kind of troubleshoot, anything like that. But that also means that I would get to be involved in a lot of tactical applications of it, if you will, even when I was a quote unquote junior rank, meaning when I was an E4, E5, that kind of thing. There's a lot more that goes definitely down on a ship, such as a lot of cleaning. A lot of people don't realize that we are almost glorified janitors, but that's because even as Navy sailors, the biggest threat to a ship is fire, and what easily goes flammable, what burns up is dust. So a lot of times we do that. I have done only one deployment, sadly, but I have gone to a couple of different places, a couple of different countries. I've really experienced some very interesting port visits, Singapore, Okinawa, as well as going to Djibouti. And lately, I've actually been in Virginia just teaching future generations of people doing the same job as I'll be doing. Um, it's just a very different experience, and if you can deal with it, then I encourage it. If you can't, then I encourage you not to come into the military. It's not for everybody, and that is okay.
What would you say the culture of the U.S. Navy is like? As it's just like a place to, be, work, common expectations,
Okay, no, that's
all
a
that
great
good stuff.
question. That's an awesome question because so many people, and even I had one idea about what it was like when I was going to join the military, because I joined as fourth generation, my great grandfather, both of my grandfathers, my mother, my father, my aunt, my uncle, and I was the only one of my generation. So I was like, okay, uphold the family honor kind of thing. No joke, a lot of people just come to work. It's just like work. Go figure. They sit there and at the door, they're like, okay, I'm here to work. Let's get this done. And as soon as they leave the door, leave the ship, they're like, cool, now I'm home. The sad part, obviously, is that sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes we do get called in. We sometimes have to work more than 8 hours a day. Sadly, our typical work week is actually supposed to be over 60 hours a week, even if we're in port. Yeah, if it's underway, it's closer to like 75. Um, there's a lot of people who, again, I'm not down on them for it, who come just to get their education, right? We have the GI Bill, we have the 9/11 kind of tuition assistance as well, and people utilize it for that. I joined when we had the recession, and it was kind of finally getting people were finally getting a little bit of opportunity to get their feet underneath them. But I was just like, I'm done with this side. There are a lot of people though who do take it seriously, and it's very sobering when you do finally get to meet and work with those kind of people. It's kind of scary to think about it, but we are war fighters. That is our job, and it is something to consider that even in the safest port, even in the safest situation, we still run the risk of disfigurement, we still run the risk of death. So as much as I might want to be like, oh yeah, it's just a job, come in, at 8 o'clock in the morning, leave at 1600, because yes, we do 24-hour time clock. Some people don't come home at 1600 for a number of different reasons. I personally, still definitely family business, but otherwise, um, I'm putting in my time. I'm trying to make it to that 20-year retirement and then work on getting my pension.
What would you like, generally speaking, like folks outside um the armed forces sort of have a general idea of that there's like a different sort of, broad brush ways that the different services are described. Would you say there's any like truth to any of that? And I know that's getting into some dangerous territory there.
Oh no, that's a fun one. That's a fun one. That's almost like when you sit there and have like your friends and family, and you'll sit there and tease and tease and tease, but as soon as somebody else outside of that group tries to, and you're like, hold the phone, who are you? Back off. We do joke, definitely. I've had a number of experiences with Marines because they are a department of the Navy, as much as they don't like being reminded of that. Um, we do joke a little bit of the fact of Marine stands for my a rides in Navy equipment. They like to joke that Navy is their Uber because we transport them wherever they gotta go. We joke that Air Force is pretty much desk jockeys and they can lock up and go home for the day, pretty much even on their duty days, which is where you have to do, in addition to your job, you have to stand a watch, you have to do extra work. And the Army, we kind of just appreciate that they go boots and on ground and we don't have to live the hard life they have. Um, I've had, I think the best opportunity I had for a lot of inter operations were not even operations. I was in Hawaii and my kindred had Navy, Marines, Air Force, and Army in it. And I'm still friends with most of the people in that group, and they're phenomenal people. We worked well together. We joked about tattooing the Marine with some glitter butterflies. It was great. He took it in awesome humor and including glitter bombs. I forgot about that part. We did do actually a glitter bomb on him. Um, it's the idea behind the difference between all of us is kind of what we have to do and where we have to do it. You want boots on ground doing kind of the basic establishing a place. You're going to want Army. You want something with a little bit more oomph and a little bit more fight. You're going to go ahead and put in the Marines. But they can also go more than just simply on the ground. You want somebody waiting in the wings on standby with a ship that has plenty of air support as well. You're going to want the Navy. You want somebody to sit there and watch you're going to want the Air Force. Not really, but there's a fair bit of things the Air Force does, mostly a lot of the Army stuff. We're still trying to find out where the Space Force fits into all of that. But mostly it's just going to be probably exactly like what everybody else has heard. I haven't heard any more than anybody else has, which is trying to deal with a lot of the fact that satellites and air is now even more an opportunity of putting intel. Like we've all seen the Chinese spy balloons. So that's kind of what we've been under the impression their focus is going to be.
Where in your experience in society do folks who sign up for the US military tend to come from? Like, what kind of backgrounds, generally speaking, have you observed? And I know this is like, broad brush, but
That's a good question. That's a good question because that's definitely gone into a couple other things. Mostly lower middle class. A lot of people get into it for healthcare. People get into it for a steady paycheck. A lot of people get into it for that college tuition assistance or that GI Bill. So it's very, very rarely have I ever seen anybody who's higher echelon. I think I've met one person who actually had super rich family. He joined the military because he wanted to work for a living. I was like, cool story, bro. Like, great at you. But a lot of people are definitely more from the lower socioeconomic echelons. Um, the cool part is obviously with it being like international, because we do actually have people join from the Philippines, as well as Guam and Puerto Rico. So it's not even just the United States as we know it. We have some territories as well as some places that strong US back. Um, but a lot of it is also very conservative. And I do mean that in the political spectrum. Not all. We do have still plenty of liberal, left leaning, or central based people. And it's pretty typical that right wing is going to be more military based, simply because the idea is we get a bonus, we get a higher bonus whenever there's a Republican in office usually. So we all like to kind of look towards that to a degree.
When you say conservative,
Mm.
is it more in the sense of like old fashioned, small c, let's not be too hasty about things kind of conservative, or more like, the much more recent kind of, red hat MAGA, um, Jesus is the God of the United States, stuff like that?
um, that's a good question about like the big C vice the small c. Um, I would say, in my experience, because I grew up a little bit in the military as well, it was Reagan era C conservative. So there was a lot more focus on fiscal, as well as some racist undertones and definitely some racial stereotypes that still to this day. But it wasn't a lot of the MAGA hat, I'd say. There's this probably last 10 years, I think, has been more eye-opening about how more centrist some of the people are, and really feeling alienated by both sides of the political spectrum. There's still a lot more religious conservatism that I would say is in the military. There's still a lot of people who don't realize some of the other faiths that are in there, even though we do have a Buddhist chaplain in the military. There's still a lot of people who are like, wait, you're pagan? What's that? So I'd probably say for now, the small c conservative. A lot more I find as people who are like, well, I don't understand that, as opposed to that's not the natural way of things.
In your experience, are the armed forces more or less diverse than broader society?
Mm, I think that's a hard one, because so many people I've heard entering the military are, in some cases, coming from not very diverse areas, because being limited in where they can go, being limited on people around them, again, based on their socioeconomic status. But when they join the military, oftentimes it's been people's first experience dealing with people of Hispanic descent, people of Black descent. I find that I would say people in the military have more diverse experiences if they're coming from an experience of what is the word, mono mono monochism. I can't remember the word right now off the top. It was like the one color, monochromatic. There we go. um but if they're coming from a position where they still have a fairly diverse area that they're from, I would say the military probably feels a little bit less diverse for them. There's still a lot of lack of probably uh, visibility for LGBTQ, lack of visibility for a lot of alternate religions, and we're still working against the idea that females can't hold positions of authority. We've gotten a lot better, particularly when we had Admiral Howard when she was promoted and put on 4 stars. She was phenomenal. As well as we had a fleet master chief, I believe, Beldo. She was amazing, and a lot of us actually had a really both of them are Black women in the military, the first one being an officer, the second one being enlisted. And a lot of us, when the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy, who is pretty much like the big enlisted guy of the Navy, was being turned over, a lot of us really liked the idea of Master Chief Eldo coming back in and taking that over. But she retired, well deserved. So she did not. But we're hoping at some point we could eventually get somebody of color and a gender other than white and male in McPawn position.
What first sparked your awareness of far right elements in the armed forces? And sort of also on the flip side of that, how does your heathenry factor into any anti-racist positions you have in relation to that?
I like the little turnabout question at the end. That's a good one. Um, Weirdly enough, the first time I ever experienced any kind of far right indications, or any kind of, I would can say, anti-diversity or bigoted concerns within the military was when I first was recruiting. Just because they had a very big concern about what certain tattoos meant, what the placement of them, and making sure that there was nothing in my background that would prevent me then from joining the military. The military, as well as police force, are very, very aware that people of the far right, people of incredibly bigoted positions of mind frames, do tend to find themselves joining the military or the police force, for a number of different reasons, which I don't feel too qualified to go into. So I think the biggest concern they had was when I told them of my tattoo, which is Tiwaz on my right wrist. And of course, we have some other runes like Othalo, who and Suelo, which are often used by people who are very much still very Nazi sympathizing. So there was some concern about that, but because of course it's not a very well publicized rune for the far right, I was much more easily able to be like, yeah, this is what it means. And they were like, oh, okay, cool. Um, with regards to my heathenry, I like that question because for so many different pagan paths, it's all been about just light and love, light and love, light and love, and just let people be people. And it was really a path of least resistance and letting things just go. And that was considered the right thing. But heathenry has always communicated itself to me. It's very active. It's not something that you just are, it's something that you do. And I think a lot of that came from one of the organizations I came through, which was Andre Fein, ADF. Yes, Irish name, but Indo-European culture. And it's not orthodoxic, which is unification via belief. It's orthopraxic, unification by practice. You do similar things across all rituals so that you can just go to any one of them and be like, I know to expect this. And that informed on it, particularly when I joined the Trove, then very big heathen organization. And when they stepped up and started speaking out against a lot of the racists in the heathen community, I think it really impacted me, and it melds perfectly well with the idea of being part of the military as well. Like, you don't just let something happen when something's wrong, when something is not how it's supposed to be. You step up, you do something about it. And that's even come to calling out some of people we considered elders in our tradition, in our society. Sadly, having to sit there and be on an author's and a well-known heathen's Facebook and see some of the stuff that they would post and be like, that's not okay, and then actually step forward and call them out. It's been hard, particularly. But at the same time, hard things are worth doing, I guess.
So building on that, there have been some prominent instances of flag rank U.S. officers, probably most notoriously General Michael Flynn, expressing very clearly far right politics and positions. I believe Flynn, for example, has been on board with claims of election fraud in 2020. Um, among many other things, he could be his own podcast all by himself. In your experience, how have actions like this been received by people who are currently serving, and is this something that ever really happens with people who are currently in the armed services and not retired for or discharged for whatever reason?
Mm. Um, there are so many people who I understand and appreciate have very big concerns about the election, very big concerns about COVID, very big concerns about where the state of this country is going. And yes, some of them do serve in the military. Um, I find in my experience that most of those conversations are hush hush. And they're hush hush because of the fact that the military has tried to steer a lot of the environment of it away from the political sense. Appreciating again that we are representatives of the country, whether the country is primarily Democratic or it's primarily Republican, whether it's going to be one or the other. They have tried to divorce a lot of the political climate from where we work. That's not to say that people don't talk. It's just usually when it concerns some of those far right or far left things. A lot of those conversations are held in whispers and held between people who already know that the person they're talking with is on their side. There's very little discourse that I've experienced occupied between the extremes. And I hate to say the extremes because so far people have been painting the far left as, people deserve to have food and water. And apparently that's incredibly extreme to consider. But it does still occur. And it's fun when it does, I think, because you tend to find more people being interested in the conversation who weren't on either ends of the spectrum. You're going to get those people who are more central and actually saying, no, I think that, yeah, this is a good idea, or no, I don't. But um, otherwise, I think something particularly that kind of was juxtaposed to me was the response to what we had when George Floyd was killed and Black Lives Matter, and then the position that came up from the January 6th riots and attempts to overthrow a legitimate election. Sadly, they occurred at different times during the COVID. So I think the responses were more based on COVID reaction as opposed to the political action. Um, there was a lot of charged conversations I remember experiencing around George Floyd, which then pulled in a lot of other people, particularly Trayvon Martin, who was a child who was killed for having a toy gun. And there seemed to be a lot more opportunity to really pull people into conversations about what actually is going on and being able to kind of open their eyes to some of the experiences that they weren't seeing or refused to see. But the reaction was definitely stay away from protests, again, based on it being COVID. It was literally in the height of COVID. And our concern was not getting military personnel sick, which would then jeopardize our mission. So I appreciate that in our area, the concept of you cannot go to these, you cannot go to these was because we couldn't even go anywhere like for families for Thanksgiving. We couldn't do anything that would put our health at risk. Mind, when it came to the staging of the attempted coup for January 6th, and I'm being very deliberate in my choices because I want to definitely emphasize what I feel about what's going on in that one. While there wasn't anything saying no, you can't, I think it was because it was more of an ignorance. I don't think a lot of people really knew that something like that was going to happen. I didn't even remember hearing that there was going to be a protest staged until I saw on the news how there was a huge rally occurring. And I was like, that's really bizarre. That's really odd. And then afterwards, there was a huge amount of shock, I think, in the military, for at least, again, from the people I experienced, about what had happened, why it had happened, and what our response was. But the response from almost every one of our supervisors, any one of our senior leadership, was the election occurred. The election um, went through that President Biden would be the next president, and that former President Trump would have to vacate come the 20th of January. Whatever your position was, that was the case. And we are the military, and we will uphold that one way or the other. So I think because of that, there weren't a lot of open conversations about whether people did agree or didn't agree. There were still those little comments here and there about, well, they found this many ballots that were unaccounted for. But it was mostly small conversations that kind of died away once everything was been said or done.
You mentioned the leadership of the armed forces, particularly trying to steer the environment within the military towards something that is, divorced from, as has been, for folks listening from outside the United States, long-standing historical tradition in the U.S. military of being as apolitical as possible. And also there have been like some prominent instances of like more inclusive policy being established, things like trans folk being allowed to serve in the armed forces, stuff like that. How effective have these institutional changes been in terms of being implemented, and has there been any like significant resistance?
Oh, this is a fun one because almost every single time one of these things is implemented or even talked about, a number of people I see comments on Facebook talking about how the military is not a social experiment. Why are you doing this? And it's just more fun because that's not generally what happens. Yes, there are some people who have expressed some concern and some legitimate questions, but also some questions that inform on their level of ignorance and their position on it. But it's a completely different culture. It's a completely different arena that is very capable of taking these grand social strides towards equality, because so often our culture is you're given an order, and as long as that order is lawful, as in you're not disobeying the Constitution, you're not disobeying the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which informs whether or not we're going to be able to actually like stay in the military or if we're going to get paid our full amount, which is a separate thing. Like as if we get held to a UCMJ article, we could then be docked in pay because we were found guilty of violating one of those aspects. But because our community as a whole is, you are told to do this, you will do this, or you will find a way to get as close to it as possible. We have made great social changes probably before and ahead, oftentimes, of the country at large. Being able to pull in Black service members and actually having them serve right alongside white service members, pulling women in and giving women close to the equal amount of pay and expectations and I'm missing words today, but essentially collaterals or compensation. There we go. Compensation that were equal to men. That was something that's still not quite done right now. We actually have the same pay. Me as somebody, as a female presenting and a male presenting, joining the same time, getting the same rank, we're going to have the same pay, period. There's a couple of things here and there that might differ based on maybe what they do as a job, but it's not going to be that much. So we have had the opportunity to outstrip overall the U.S. culture, I think, in diversity. There's still a ways to go. There's still some resistance that comes from it because our military members are all based on individuals and our country and people from different areas of that country and internationally, like I said before, where they come from and what their values are. But it's not like the military has said you can no longer have your own values so much as your values get to support the US military values and how we actually go ahead and set up our entire lifestyle here. Um, the resistance that I've seen, again, it went underground. Almost every other time it would come up, it either went underground or it was literally just brushed off like there was never an issue. I was thankful to be very early on in my naval career, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And we had a huge sit down, almost a 2 hour conversation where we were being told, okay, here's how it's going to go forward. And all of us there are like, okay, duh. Like, finally, it's a great thing that you're doing this because this needed to be done like 5 years ago. Because so many of us already have been like, okay, we know the person next to us that we're serving with is gay. They're doing the job well, and I can rely on them. There's not an issue. The transgender has been an interesting one because the time that it came out and then the following administration very much politicized it. So there was still a lot of dialogue that didn't seem to be as accepting. But once the administration changed again and very overtly said, no, transgender people will be allowed. Here's how we're making it happen. Here's what we're doing. All the resistance that I saw, again, went underground. But since then, some of the people that I've even heard any resistance to have been incredibly welcoming of those transgender members. I've had the privilege and the honor of serving with a handful of known transgender women. And it's been awesome. It's been absolutely phenomenal to see everybody around them be completely supportive of their career, of their learning environment, of their working environment, and also actually approach them as people, especially from people who were originally very anti-trans.
What do you think is most important for people to understand who outside of the armed forces about the US military, far right politics, and all that other fun stuff, especially when we're living in a world where, January 6th happened. There was the very publicized Reichsbürger coup led by Prince Heinrich the 13th, which sounds like something you'd see in a 90s cartoon, but there you go.
Yep.
And then everything that happened in Brazil recently. What do you think is most important for people to understand about particularly the US Armed Forces in this environment we now find ourselves in?
US military is a product of the people it's pulling from, but also the trailblazers, in the sense of how much we're willing to sit there and embrace the people of our country. And I know it's going to sound weird like that. Um, we do have still a lot of people who are very reserved in venturing out into the political spectrum outside of where they are used to. But regardless, and especially regardless, whatever reason people have joined the military, there has been still the concentration of preserving the Constitution at all events. And that has been, thankfully, I think the amazing underlying feature that all of us can agree on is that the Constitution is our foundation throughout all. But also that the military is not necessarily always the one that you need to hold in highest regard as well. Like, we're people. We're absolutely people. And I've had great experiences with it and great experiences with great people. Um, but we're people. We're going to make mistakes on our own individually. And that is not necessarily the reflection on the US government services. I think that's the biggest thing that a lot of people might forget is that we're individuals, and a lot of the things that we have to do, say, act, and be, we appreciate that it's not going to be us individually, our name in the paper. It's going to be US soldier, US Marine, US Navy. And taking it to understand that individually you might have some people who are saying this. But just because they're in the military doesn't necessarily mean you have to give them that extra oomph of credibility. Like that's another feature. That's like sitting there saying they belong to this one club. That's not to say that that's their character, that imbues them with some sort of lofty idea of how right they are, how amazing they are. No, we're people. We're people. And we're going to be flawed and we're going to get it right every once in a while too. And in the process, we're going to be learning probably alongside everybody else is too.
For one last question, before we go on to pluggables, to circle back to 2020 for a minute, one particular development that was concerning were threats that were made by the administration at the time to deploy U.S. troops stateside for various reasons. And there were instances, like, for example, in Portland, where federal agents were deployed and observed engaging in questionable, potentially extra legal activities. Do you think there is any desire, appetite, or anything like that at all to actually like do anything like that among service members? Like, are there people that are like, yes, we need to go in and impose order or something like that?
We kind of have both. Again, it's run a myriad of people. We've had some people who are like, yeah, this is our whole job to go in and make sure we maintain order and discipline. And then there are just as many people going, these are American citizens and it's their right to protest. And that's similarly to what we had with regards to January 6th, which is sad to say as well. To a degree, there was a right to protest. And we acknowledge and appreciate a lot of us in there are like, that's under the Constitution. That's a protected right. But there was also a big fear of people having to be deployed, not being in a position of making a lot of those policy decisions of overarching decisions. I couldn't tell you what happened behind those closed doors. I know as an individual sailor, most of the conversations I had were, what if I have to go in and face a U.S. citizen and potentially hurt them because they're here protesting, whether or not we agreed with them? What if? And it wasn't the whole, oh, this is going to be exciting. What if? This was what would I do? And a lot of people genuinely had a question of where do I say no to an order? Where do I say this isn't a lawful order? Where do we say I'm willing to go to jail if I don't do this? Where do we say I'm willing to follow this order and not be able to have quiet nights of sleep for the next years? There was, in my experience, there were some people who were just not capable of understanding everything that came up from it, and definitely wanted to be the gung-ho and ride into battle and be the cavalry on both cases, on January 6th and in all of the Black Lives Matters instances and all of the riots and protests that were attempting to actually say, Black lives do matter. You had people on both sides saying, yes, I want to go, or no, I don't want to go. And I think that part is just the scarier part. Again, going back to the climate that we have, we're here to protect the US one way or the other. And it's very scary to consider, what is that one way or the other? Where does that end for you individually? Where does that end for being on the other side of a riot line and seeing people we know, seeing people we might agree with, or seeing people that we don't agree with whatsoever, but also don't want to infringe on their rights. Um, I think that's been a really hard thing. I think a lot of people, especially today, have, um, especially in the heathen culture. It's always been, I've always not appreciated the Christian bashing, and I know it sounds weird because most of us have had those experiences where we've been diminished, we've been pushed aside, and it's primarily been from the Christian aspect. But I also don't think that bashing them is helping our situation, particularly using their religion, using their politics, using whatever their position is as an insult, because you're still then insulting something that has nothing to do with what they're proposing. I know that might be very like around the bend.
No, that makes sense. So thank you again for coming on. Do you have anything you'd like to plug? If you've got any social media, yours or someone else's, that you'd like to promote.
Oh goodness. Okay, there is one person social media that I absolutely phenomenally enjoy. She is a military officer who actually has a Instagram that I follow on her. She's Mill Mama underscore on the run. She is a Navy officer who's currently going to college, advancing herself. She goes through a lot of different pieces of kind of positions, not heathen specific, but just military life. And it's been really fun. It's been really cool. Um, I've enjoyed watching her. Something just to consider and probably plug for myself is that we're military members, but we're individual citizens. So a lot of what we do and say, it's as ourselves. It's not the Navy saying it. It's not the armed forces saying it. It's us individually saying it. I definitely want to make sure I'm saying that. Like, all of this has been my experience, what I've seen.
Well, thank you again. It's been great having you on. And this has been Ryan Smith at the Wayward Wanderer, now signing off. Else's that you'd like to promote?
Oh goodness. Okay, there is one person social media that I absolutely phenomenally enjoy. She's a military officer who actually has a Instagram that I follow on her. She's Mill Mama underscore on the run. She is a Navy officer who's currently going to college, advancing herself. She goes through a lot of different pieces of kind of positions, not heathen specific, but just military life. And it's been really fun. It's been really cool. Um, I've enjoyed watching her. Something just to consider and probably plug for myself is that we're military members, but we're individual citizens. So a lot of what we do and say, it's as ourselves. It's not the Navy saying it. It's not the armed forces saying it. It's us individually saying it. I definitely want to make sure I'm saying that. Like, all of this has been my experience, what I've seen.
Well, thank you again. It's been great having you on. And this has been Ryan Smith at the Wayward Wanderer, now signing off. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to help support more work like this, then please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you early access to podcast episodes, ad-free listening, monthly patrons-only live stream sessions with your host and author of The Way of Fire and Ice, Ryan Smith, and more. Please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. Thanks for listening.